Frozen Witness, written by Mike Grimes, copyright 2008. Part 1. Ray walked steadily past several aisles across the front of the local food store. There was a scent of caution about him, even though the store had limited security, and he knew exactly where to go to avoid the cameras that were actually operational. He had worked for a security service company a few years back and knew this particular business was so small that it could not afford the type of high-end pivoting cameras necessary to prevent shoplifting and other misdoings. The ones he walked casually past now moved, but he knew from experience that they were not able to record, let alone transmit an image. He found the aisle where the canned meals and pasta were located, an aisle he knew rather well in his bachelorhood, then rubbed his scruffy chin and pondered the variety on the shelves, as if he cared about his child being bored with whatever he chose. He actually did have a child at home, though it was not his own, but Ray tried not to think of that, instead focusing on getting out of the store before anyone might recognize him or stop him to have a mindless conversation about local affairs or sports teams or something else that would sever into his schedule for the day. He made his way to the registers at the front of the store, pausing only to grab a few packs of pre-portioned fruit cups along the way. As he paid for his items, he saw the cute blonde at the register he usually went to. He wished he had time to banter with her like he had so many times before, but he just said hello and placed his items on the conveyor belt. She was adorable, in her 20s, he presumed, and she had one of those wide-hipped, small-waist bodies that were becoming more and more apparent on the evolutionary scale of women. Her hair was always in a ponytail, and he often wondered what it would feel like to hold it and yank on it while he fucked her. But he soon finished checking out, collecting his change from the automated register, and walked out, purposely but not willingly avoiding eye contact with his favorite blonde cashier. It would be the last time he would see her, though he did not realize that yet. It was winter, and all around him cars moved carefully on wet, icy pavements. People scurried through the cold, their breath clouding the air around their heads momentarily. In that area of Pennsylvania, only the tourists and outsiders were not used to the frigid weather that came with the first few months of the year. Snow was as normal there as people having two eyes and a nose, covering the ground like a white, downy blanket in some areas, and looked like charcoal ashes in areas that had been plowed. On his way home, Ray imagined whining and dining the cashier from the store in hopes that it would get her into bed with him faster. He would have to shave and wash his best shirt, which had been in a hamper for about a month. He would take her back to his place and coerce her into having a lot of unprotected sex. Well, maybe not. But the prospect of it sounded amazing to him. It would be easy. She was so friendly and flirtatious. For example, she used to work at the video store where he rented porn, and smiled as he left and said, "Have a good night." Then there was that time outside the food store when she asked him for a light, and after a few minutes allowed him to caress her calf while she explained how great her new shaving razor was. Her skin was warm and smooth as satin, and she smiled the entire time and did not tell him to stop, though he did eventually out of respect. It plagued his fantasies forever. But now his thoughts turned to how badly he needed to get home without getting pulled over or otherwise drawing attention to himself. It had been bad enough that his truck, an older model, was pretty recognizable, and he had to pass by several homes where people knew him to get home. If any of them were outside and waved at him, or looking out their window as he drove past, he was screwed. He realized this point and said to himself simply, "Shit." He made it to the street he lived on, which was long and rural as hell. It was barely paved and made his truck creak and groan as he tried to drive down it as casually as possible. He fought to relax and shifted his vehicle into four-wheel drive. He felt his tires dig into the firmly packed snow beneath him. The weather was milder than it had been lately, but it would be much, much colder that night, dropping into the 1 to 5 degree range. There was even talk of yet another few inches of snow overnight. Perfect, Ray said out aloud. Just perfect. Ray hated snow. The only trade-off was that his home was one of the farthest from town, which meant his end of the road he lived off of was often impassable except to local traffic and four-wheelers and snowmobiles, which meant police patrols were virtually non-existent. Ray pulled into his driveway, which was long, and left his house somewhat hard to view from the road, let alone near the nearest neighbor without binoculars. Even still, the side and the front of his property was lined with tall shrubs that blocked the majority of what people could see as they drove past or pulled into neighbors' driveways. He parked his truck and got out, the door creaking as he slammed it shut. He walked around the front of it and noticed a huge wad of slush matted into his utility bumper. He was not wearing gloves, so he stopped only long enough to barely pick it free with his fingers. Any longer and the cold wetness would have pissed him off to a cussing tirade. After passing through the tall wooden gate at his backyard, Ray turned to meet face to face the crooked smile snowman, freshly made the day before by his child. He stood and stared at it for a moment or two, and its crude face of rocks and a carrot beamed to him exaggeratingly. It was a little creepy, and both scared him and ticked him off at the same time. He also felt at times that the icy figure was watching him. "What the hell do you want?" he asked. He could have sworn the snowman had been facing away from his house when he left for the store. Now it looked as though it had found something more interesting to look at through the front windows of Ray's home. Maybe the kid had turned him during one of his 20-minute-per-day playtimes, and Ray had just not noticed. Still, he could have sworn. Ray set the plastic bags down on the path leading to his back door and stomped through slush and snow up to his knees. He promptly plucked the snowman's head up off its shoulders, spun it around 180 degrees, and plopped it back down on the stack again. "There," he said, as he wiped cold moisture from his cold hands. "Look at the frickin' bushes for all I care." He then picked up his bags and continued on his way. He opened the side door of his house and disappeared through it. The house was old, bland and dusty. It was furnished and not in disrepair, with only some dust in hard-to-reach areas. The inside was designed to look like a log cabin, and nearly every surface of floor and wall was some sort of wood-based material. The kitchen was small, with older appliances, including a stove that was hardly ever used. A huge fireplace was in the far wall to the right, in the spacious yet cozy living room. The sofa and fabrics of the room were carryovers from when his parents were alive. They had both died several years ago, never mind how, and Ray had never gotten around to changing things, nor did he rarely care to. His life was one of a bachelor, barely dressing in more than a bathrobe and boxers for more than a few days, usually to get more beer or supplies from local merchants. There was a tall staircase near the center of the room, between the living room and the small dining area, though Ray mostly slept on the couch. Ray unpacked his grocery bags and haphazardly placed them on a counter. He stuck all the canned goods into the cupboard above, save for a small can of circle-shaped pasta with meatballs no adult in their right mind would consume. Ray grimaced at the thought of those meatballs, and his stomach growled contrarily. He opened the can with a manual can opener and slopped its contents into a plastic bowl. He reached for the package of fruit cups and tore one from the group. He portioned one serving into a smaller bowl and dumped the rest in his mouth, heavy, sugary syrup running down his chin. He grabbed a spoon from the dish rack near the sink beside him and stuck it in the bowl of pasta. He started to walk out of the kitchen but paused. He went to the microwave and popped open the door. He set the fruit cup aside, pulled the spoon from the pasta, and shoved it into his mouth before heating the lunchtime meal. He was anxious for the 30 seconds to end, and drummed his fingers on the countertop as he waited. When only 3 seconds remained, he opened the door and removed the slightly warmed bowl. He put the spoon back into the bowl, grabbed a juice box, and juggled everything he was carrying as he made his way down the corner and around the corner of the room, through a wooden door and down a flight of steps. Part 2, copyright 2008. In the basement of Ray's house, Sammy Sebastian, age 8, was blindfolded and tied to a bed. The young boy had never seen the inside of his captor's house, but he knew the stale-smelling room he was being held in was downstairs, and that the upstairs was apparently rather small. He never really knew the time, only by being awakened to eat cold cereal or plain oatmeal, and in the late afternoon when he was given a cold bologna sandwich or warm pasta from a can. Each day he was taken outside to a snow-covered, fenced-in yard where a man in a green army jacket let him play and build snowmen. The man always wore a ski mask and never let Sammy look in his direction, lest he face dire consequences. Sammy was allowed to use the bathroom a few times a day, mainly after meals and before bed, and sometimes he was allowed the privilege of watching TV, but only if he faced the wall and did not look at anything else around him. He had tested this only once before, and though he did not have ample time to take in much about his surroundings, the television was immediately turned off, leaving him in a pitch-black darkness until his blindfold was returned to his face. The mask was not removed for any reason for 2 whole days. After that, Sammy had learned his lesson. 30 minutes a day without that blindfold was worth not knowing where he was. The only time the man struck him was when he spit out his food. Sammy came from a wealthy family, and the slimy texture of the pasta rings nauseated him. But he was never hit again, and he never tempted fate again. There was a peace between him and his captor. The man even complimented him on the skillful way in which he made snowmen. Sammy never stopped counting the lunches he was served, rationalizing that he had been where he was for 8 days now. He missed his mom and dad and his dog, Shadow, a husky. He liked to imagine Shadow sitting on the porch, watching and waiting for his young owner's return. Sammy knew from the lack of voices that the man was the only one in the house, and no one was ever heard coming near the house itself. He also never heard the man use the telephone, which meant he either did not have one, which seemed impossible, or he went elsewhere to conduct any type of business that might reunite Sammy with his family. If there was no phone in the house, then Sammy could not even call for help if he were able to escape, so he stopped imagining he could. Sammy also gave up listening for the mailman, guessing his captor had a box at the local post office. The man left for an hour or so each morning, and upon returning, sat in a chair upstairs from Sammy, and the sounds of tearing envelopes could be heard from the basement below. There was only one time when another person came in the house, a woman. She was very quiet and gentle, and during her only visit, Sammy heard only a short conversation before she came downstairs and crawled into bed with him. She was soft, and she held him. She told Sammy she once had a son like him, but he was taken from her. The woman did nothing out of the ordinary to Sammy. She simply cuddled him, stroked his hair, sang to him, and called him by her son's name. He spoke once, asking her why. Her hand then smacked his cheek, and she hissed at him, "Shh, no talking." She left shortly thereafter and never returned. The whole thing made Sammy miss his own mother, something fierce, and he cried himself to sleep that night, even more so than usual. Although the man allowed Sammy to play in the yard and make his army of snowmen, he could not help but notice how his playtime always ended when he finished the faces of his creations. They looked happy and innocent to him, but the man seemed to get weirded out when he saw Sammy constructing them. Each day when Sammy's playtime began, in fact, the faces of his previous endeavors were always wiped clean, save for one which now had a backwards head for some reason. Sammy had no idea if anyone was coming to rescue him, nor did he have any thoughts of the man's intentions. He did not seem to enjoy hurting Sammy, and he never tried anything icky toward him, so Sammy deduced that he might be able to use this as a weakness on the man's part. Follow patterns, like counting the days, among other things, and maybe he would have a chance, if any chance at all. Had to act. But how? There had to be something. That evening, while Sammy was watching TV, he noticed something glimmering out of the corner of his eye. He looked, shifting his eyes but not his head, and saw an exposed portion of copper wire in the cord for the television. After he was blindfolded and the man went back upstairs, Sammy thought about that exposed wire more intensely. He carefully moved his foot and gently tugged the plug from the wall. He paused, nervously waiting for the man to investigate, but he never did. Sammy fell asleep and waited. Part 3. Copyright 2008. The following day, Ray came inside and fixed the boy's lunch. He fed him and then sat in his favorite chair to relax and drink too many beers. He watched as more snow began to fall and drifted off to sleep. He awoke to find the snow still falling and looked out the window of his living room. It was still daylight, but nearly 7 or 8 inches had fallen. He grunted at the thought of plowing and shoveling yet more fucking snow and decided to check on the kid. When Ray arrived downstairs, the boy stirred at the sound of him. "It's all right," Ray said to calm him down, and then belched on his earlier drinks. His breath offended even himself, and he waved it away from his face like it was an annoying mosquito or gnat. As he made his way toward the boy, in his drunken stupor, he forgot about the crack in the floor and stumbled, catching himself on the bed rail. He closed his eyes and shook his head. "You gotta go to the bathroom, kid?" he asked gruffly. Sammy nodded and was surprised when the man pulled off his blindfold. He could smell the alcohol in the man's breath and clothes, but was more surprised by the man's actions. He rarely let Sammy use the bathroom when it wasn't just after mealtime. Sammy opened his eyes, and when he looked up and around, and no harm came to him, he realized the moment to escape had come. The scruffy, toothy man untied him, but Sammy made no immediate effort to get away. The man appeared to trust him, so he had to choose his actions carefully for the maximum effort. "Can I watch TV when I get back?" Sammy asked with a quiet, manipulative tone. "Sure," said the man. He smiled and reached for the remote for the TV. He tried to use the buttons, but the TV did not come on. Sammy watched as the man leaned over the TV cart and pulled the plug up in his hand. When he looked at Sammy thought for sure he was going to get smacked or clobbered. But the man only smiled and said, "Here's the problem." He seemed to forget his intentions with Sammy, leaning way over to plug in the television. When he did, there was a loud pop and a small flash of light. Sammy watched the man fall backwards and decided it was as good a moment as ever to run. As the man lay motionless on the floor, probably from his intoxication more than anything, Sammy bolted for the stairs and booked up to the upper floor. He emerged in a hall, which he knew from his playtimes, hooked left and then right before he could go outside. He ran through the tiny kitchen and to the side door of the man's house. He stopped when he spotted a cell phone on the counter, picked it up, swiped the menu, turned on the GPS, and dialed 911. Sammy could now hear footsteps in the basement stairs. He threw the phone in a drawer near him and carefully closed it. He made his way to the door as fast as he could. As soon as he jerked it open, however, a bulging hand shoved it closed again. "You're not going anywhere, kid," the man said sternly. Sammy fell to the floor as he turned to run back through the house. Before he could get to his feet, the captor was on him. The last thing Sammy saw was a piece of wood in the man's right hand, coming down against his head. Ray sat his ass on the floor beside the unconscious boy and held his head. The excitement had awakened the gerbil inside his brain, and he was getting a bad headache. It felt like a truck was smashing through his head. Despite the pain, though, he carried the boy back down to the basement and tied him up again. He almost cared at that point whether the boy would live or die, but it wasn't a question a few more beers couldn't handle. Several minutes later, another 6-packs worth of empty cans were scattered all over the carpeted floor around Ray's favorite recliner. Ray jerked upright suddenly, as though, and as he thought, he heard a tiny, hollow sound behind him. After a few more seconds, he heard it again. It was in his mind, he deduced, a construct of too much alcohol and the warranted paranoia of holding the boy for ransom. But it was not in his mind. The noise rang in his ears a third time, and he stood to listen for its source. Knock. It was coming from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Ray rubbed his face with both hands, then said irritably, I'm coming, hold on, you're... whatever. He opened the door, but there was no one there. He stepped over the threshold and looked around. He stepped back inside and was about to close the door when he saw several small spots on the door where snowballs had apparently been thrown. There were no footprints anywhere, but he still thought of the obvious. Damned kids, he shouted into the darkness. He slammed the door and locked it, shutting out the cold night air. He sighed. I gotta get to bed, he mumbled to himself. Then he made his way haphazardly toward the foot of the stairs. Splat! The wet sounds came from across the room on the far side of his house. Ray rushed to the window there, now smeared with a freshly thrown snowball, and flung it open. He leaned out and yelled into the chilly, snowy night. You goddamn kids! I'll... He was cut off by a snowball, splattering him squarely in the forehead. Ray cussed as he wiped the icy-cold wetness from his face. He spit the slush from his mouth, making loud raspberry sounds with his lips and tongue. That does it, he screamed, and he yanked the window shut and locked it. That fucking does it! He was about to open the front door when a small, glistening light flickered in his peripheral vision. A long, wet puddle was there on the floor, the wooden part of the floor, and stretched into the kitchen nearby. Ray followed it with his drunken eyes. Bits of icy slush were melting in its wake. His brow furrowed questioningly, and he rubbed his head, thoroughly confused. The air inside the house felt increasingly colder for some reason, though the front door was not open. It was then that he heard the floorboards creak behind him. He whirled around and came to realize the chill in the air actually came from the snowman from the yard. It was standing a foot or two from where Ray was standing, staring him down with black, stony eyes. Its mouth, also made of small rocks, was flipped upside down as it leered at him, its eyes reshaped into those of sheer hatred. Before Ray could react to the impossible sight, the snowman coiled up his thick, twiggy arms and backhanded him with his fist. The blow sent the drunken kidnapper backward, sailing loudly over an end table. Ray got to his feet, and with shaking hands, held the lamp out in front of him, searching the room. Unbelievably, he was alone. He became aware of the taste of blood in his mouth, and as the sudden, eerie solitude engulfed him. When he assumed he was safe, he stumbled to the back door of the house, grabbing his truck keys from the holder on the wall. When he got outside, the coast was still clear. He was still alone. Ray got to his truck and turned the key. The engine struggled to start at first, but then roared to life, headlights blaring out in front of it. A few yards away, a wiry wooden hand jerked a hatchet from the top log on the pile of firewood. Ray sped out of his parking space too hastily and nearly found himself stuck in a deep, downy snowdrift. The truck stalled. Ray cranked the key several times, and still the engine would not turn over. Finally it started. When the headlights came on, however, the snowman was standing just a few feet in front of Ray's truck. He did not move, but he was holding the hatchet over his head, as if prepared to strike, possibly hurl it in Ray's direction. Ray shifted into drive and floored the gas. He did not move. The tires spun wildly, regurgitating slush and snow out behind them. Soon enough, the tires dug into the stony driveway, and the truck lurched forward straight towards the evil snowman, which did not move out of the way. Ray screamed as his truck hit the slushy humanoid, obliterating it into wet dust and splattering him all over the huge oak tree behind it. The hatchet broke free from the sticky fingers that held it, allowing it to come crashing through the windshield of the truck. Ray dodged it just in time, the weapon lodging itself in the headrest. He was just barely able to recover in time to brace himself as the tires slid forward at full speed, bounding upward and into the trunk of the tree. Ray awakened a moment later to feel a sharp pain in his face. He felt warm wetness on his lips. His nose was broken. Not only that, but his head throbbed even more than it already had been. He groaned and fell free of the truck as he shoved the door open. From what Ray could tell through his blurred vision, the front end of his truck was smashed to hell, fragments of it in the snow beneath where the bumper used to be. Steam hissed from the radiator, and the maple-sweet aroma of coolant filled the silent air. Ray wiped his nose, barely conscious of the pain or obscene amount of blood gushing from his face. He spat out a wad of bloody spit and kicked his flattened front tire in frustration. Then he looked at the tree itself and laughed. There was a huge splatter of snow there, above the hood of his truck, and slimy slush ran down the bark as a radiator heated it to a melting point. He whooped and leaped for joy, laughing out loud. Turning to the tire tracks behind his truck, he spotted crushed snowman parts in his wake, rocks from his face, its stupid carrot nose, and splinters of what was left of its bony, sticky arms and fingers. "I got you, you fucking bastard," he yelled into the night. "I stomped the holy shit out of you." But Ray did not see the pile of snow forming on the hood of his truck behind him. He was too distracted by his triumph to notice the head taking shape above round shoulders, as frozen, snowy eyes sculpted themselves out of nothingness. Ray made his way to his front door, ready to go inside, get warmed up, and drink himself to death if he could. He paused at the bottom step, as his head was spinning wildly for a moment. It was then that someone tapped him on the shoulder. Ray felt a chill, colder than the weather, run down his spine. He was almost too afraid to look, but he forced his head to turn. The snowman, or what looked like it, was there, deformed grotesquely and barely recognizable save for that creepy, hell-bent face of his. He seemed to have legs now, though his icy feet were merged with the snow beneath him, as if the crystals gave him life, like he and the snow around him were one demonic creature. His body looked much more human, and he had arms made of snow and ice, and even though it seemed impossible, the newer version of him scared Ray twice as badly as the original one. The snowman's face grimaced as he drew his right hand back, curling it into a huge white fist. As he swung, Ray tried to block the attack, thinking that it was only snow hurling at him, but the force of the blow broke both bones of his forearm like twigs. The other snowy arm came forward, striking Ray in the chest, sending him sailing through the air and into the front wall of his house. Ray crumpled to the cement porch and immediately fought to get to his feet and escape. Before he could get very far, the snowman was upon him, grabbing his shirt, so he could not get away. He was held there in the strong grip, like a mouse being toyed with by a cat. Ice formed at the point where the snow met fabric, ensuring Ray would not get away. He felt himself shoved against the wall, then turned roughly around. Icicles jingled above him. Ray tore and grabbed at the cold arms, pinning him to the wall. No matter how hard he tried, he could not get free. He was trapped, and the fear of the end of him was coming. "What?" Ray screamed at his captor. "What do you want? What are you? Why are you?" The snowman brought his face closer to that of his own, as if for emphasis. The closer it came to Ray's face, the colder his face became, until tiny icy crystals emerged all over his scruffy, ruddy face. Then the face of the snowman changed, morphed into something Ray recognized right away, a face he knew too well recently. Sammy. Ray laughed in his delirium. "The kid? That's what this is about?" Then the face morphed once more into a much smaller image. Ray had to squint to see it clearly. In the clear sculpture that was the snowman's face, Ray saw a scene. It moved like a movie, though that was completely preposterous. It was little Sammy in Ray's backyard making a snowman. The face changed again, this time showing the moment when Ray hit Sammy with a piece of wood for trying to escape. After that, the face returned to that of the leering, evil visage of the snowman. Ray bargained as best he could. Wait a second. I'll go get him. I'll check on him. He's okay. He really is. I didn't hit him that hard. Let me show you. So let me go. He was pulled forward and then slammed back against the wall. Several feet away, some of the icicles fell, piercing the ground like tent spikes. Come on, Ray pleaded. He's okay, really. Another violent bump against the wall, and more icicles fell, closer to Ray's shoulder this time. Miraculously, the ones above him were holding fast, but not for long. Ray began to sob. Please, please, I'll take him home in the morning. No, tonight. I'll take him home right now. Just please let me die. Don't let me die. Don't let me die. The snowman loosened his grip on Ray's shirt, just enough to give him some slack between them and the wall. Then suddenly, without a sound, the snowman shoved into Ray's chest, pounding him against the wall even harder than before. The icicles above finally gave up their grip and fell downward, sliding through the topmost parts of Ray's body like arrows through soft serve ice cream. Just as fast, the snowman broke apart into dusty snow crystals and collapsed into a pile at Ray's feet. Next part, copyright 2008. 2 days later, Sammy's parents were still awaiting word from Ray about their son. They were desperate, understandably, and needed answers. They were near death with worry, and still the phone did not ring. For 2 long days they had waited, and nothing was happening. While Sammy's mother fought the growing need for sleep, his father fought growing rage and loss of sanity. He felt absolutely helpless. He was powerless against this man who had their son, and he was nearing his breaking point. Suddenly a tiny voice said something behind him. It was Sammy. His words were barely audible and not very clear, but he was home. His parents rushed to him and embraced him, showering him with kisses and tears. It took them what seemed like forever to notice how cold he was. Back at Ray's home, the police were gathering what they needed from his property. With little Sammy's testimony and Ray a cold shadow of his former self, the case was officially closed. They found the bodies of 3 children later that spring, and when they went over the backyard with an X-ray sensor. When they removed Ray's body from the side of his house, they needed a stepladder to reach him. After that, it was just a matter of removing the thick icicles that pinned his shoulders to the wall.